So, today we're going to talk about a very important issue that we really should be doing more about in built environment, whether it's in public sector or private sector. And we know something is happening around rising sea levels and flooding, but we don't really seem to be doing enough around it in the planning and policy response area, which really is quite alarming. So today on the PlaceTech Podcast, I'm Paul Unger, editor of PlaceTech, and I'm joined by a couple of experts in this field. Paul Sayers, water management researcher, consultant, advises UK government and others on flood risk, and Jeremy Hinds from Savills, a planning and development director there. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining. Paul Sayers, do you want to just give us a quick summary of the recent papers that you've written when it comes to England and rising sea levels, please?
Yeah, thanks. So we've been working on issues of flooding and flood risk and flood risk at the coast as well as inland. And we all recognise there's a growing gap between the climate risk we face and the level of adaptation we're undertaking, and we've got to address that adaptation deficit as it's often described, and that will get bigger and wider as the future goes on. But we also expect adaptation to be a real central pillar of how we respond to climate change. It doesn't remove the case for mitigation at all. Mitigation remains the core focus, but in that context, as we've seen in the recent COP, adaptation is a central part of that. And one of the things we looked at recently was how we are responding at the coast. We know sea levels are rising around about 16. We've already observed around about 16 centimetres of sea level rise since 1900, around about. And we know that sea levels will continue to rise to some extent, regardless of how successful we are with mitigation, because a lot of it's baked in. The sea level will continue to rise in response. We can mitigate how high that sea level continues to rise through mitigation, but there is already a bit of inertia in the system that it will rise at the coast. And we're quite good at what we call incremental adaptation, which means responding incrementally to our change in sea level, so adding a little bit of height to our defences, for example, in a simplistic way, but doing things that are relatively straightforward to do, and that even includes quite major infrastructure investments. But what we're really quite less good at is where there's a transformational change that's required, where we have to respond to changing sea levels in a way that really does change the system. And we looked at parts around the English coast of where there might be pressure as sea levels increase. And we expect, for example, that sea levels might rise by about a metre by 2100 or thereabouts. There's not too much uncertainty in that we will get to a metre. It's just a matter of when, not really if we will get to a metre of sea level rise. And we looked at those places around the coast that might be under pressure, that they would be very difficult to maintain the existing position of the coastline under those kind of as the sea level rises. And we identified around about almost 30% of the English coastline will be experiencing that kind of pressure to do something quite different to the way we currently manage the coastline as sea levels rise.
Just cutting across there, Paul, I think it's fair to say that understanding what is meant by the coastline, dare I suggest, is a fluid definition on the basis that it's not just the immediate coast. We're talking also about low-lying areas where rivers sort of empty themselves into the sea. So the vulnerability is probably as great in some of those areas than on the immediate coast. And just picking up your point, Paul, about the increase in sea levels, of that 16 centimetres you cited since about 1900, it's perhaps quite startling to point out that 10 centimetres of that 16 is accounted for from the period 1993 to date. So we're seeing not now just a gradual. We can't say it's 16 centimetres over the course of 120 years. we're talking an increasingly rapid amount of sea rise. And so we might get to the 1 metre figure somewhat sooner than people anticipate.
On both points, we're seeing sea level rise increasing in terms of rate of increase, and we may well achieve 1 metre or experience 1 metre much sooner than people think. We might even experience more than that by 2100. And also at the coast, people might think of 1 or 2 centimetres or even 10 centimetres sea level rise. What does that actually really mean? Or even half metre? That's not very much. You could envisage someone saying, but at the coast, the energy arriving at the coast is a cube power on the size of the wave that arrives at the coast, and the size of the wave that arrives at the coast is around much of the UK what they call depth limited. So what we experience at the coast is limited. The wave conditions we experience at the coast are limited by the depth of water. So as that depth of water increases, not too much, the power of the wave energy arriving at the coast is much greater. So what you have to handle at the coast is much increased. It's not. You mustn't think of sea level rise like a rising water on a lake. It's not. It's not functioning like that. It's bringing with it much more energy arriving at that.
It's not quite a benign picture. So Jeremy, in property terms, how is this playing out when it comes to things like planning and spatial strategy to make sure that we're taking all this into account, if indeed we are?
Yeah, the volume of the debate on this topic in planning and development is deafening by its silence. And the problem we have is that people tend to think of problems caused by sea level rises as happening elsewhere. I mean, it's a function of the entire climate change debate that we as human beings seem to be able to castigate this as a problem that's happening not to us but somebody else. So it's a problem where the Maldives disappear. It was a problem where the deltas around some of the great rivers of the world will be submerged and so on. What we're not doing is identifying within our own shores, literally, where these problems are going to become manifest. So we have in the UK a very well advanced plan making system by which we deal with development. It's well understood, even if it's sort of maligned at times. And I was sort of interested in what are our planning systems actually dealing about this. And by way of illustration, I looked at what Warrington is doing about it. And I did it Warrington for 2 reasons, and this is not to castigate Warrington at all. But one, that they are coming right to the very end of their current plan making process. So with a fair wind behind them, their current local plan should be adopted within about 18 months, might be a bit sooner. And that will take Warrington's planners to the period to 2038. If you word search their plan and look how many times they deal with flood, there's 114 references to flood. And they have to deal with flood in Warrington because it's built around the River Mersey. So Warrington does tend to flood, and the flood risk is well identified in that sense. But what is not identified is flood risk caused by rises in sea levels. And so when I said earlier that what is understood to be the coast is fluid, and we can't just confine it to, if you like, the immediate point where the Mersey empties itself out into the sea, we also need to know what is happening to the effect of sea level rises further upstream. Now, Climate Central, an organisation that was founded about 2008 by scientific community to provide objective evidence on facts to contribute to what was then the emerging debate on climate change, produced a plan of the effects, particularly in Europe, and that you can go online to see their site. It's climatecentral.org, and if you focus in on Warrington, there's a whole stretch of Warrington that is anticipated to be underwater directly as a result of rising sea levels. Now, the area of land that is affected, shown to be affected, vastly extends beyond the existing floodplain of the River Mersey. and no account has been made by the council of the effect of annual flooding on the new floodplains. So over 3,000 of the housing that is allocated in the plan is proposed to be built on land that Climate Central identify is at significant risk of being underwater.
I really find that extraordinary that we're planning thousands of homes on areas that we know are going to be underwater. I mean, how have we ended up at that situation?
So there's a few things it's probably worth just commenting on there. So we did some work recently on just responding to climate change around the UK coast and the scale of the challenge. And that looks around the whole of the coast, and that considers how sea level rise will influence flood risk within the coastal floodplains. And there are places like London that, in fact, you'll protect. We in our paper we don't suggest that London will be underwater, because in fact, I worked on the Thames project called the Thames Estuary 2100 programme, and there's a really strong case for protecting London. So, in fact, we looked out to 4 metres of sea level rise, and still there was a strong case for protecting London. And there are most of the major cities fall in that category. And one of the things that we highlighted in the paper was there are often smaller communities, not insignificant communities in terms of scale of size, and involving many houses, that are more difficult to protect as sea levels increase and the benefit cost cases will be less. And there's this program of planning around the coast that I'm sure everyone's aware of, these so-called shoreline management plans that think about how we might manage our coast in the long term. And quite a few of those suggest in 50 years' time we might realign our coast, i.e. we might change the location of our coast. But very few know how to transition from the current position to a different position in the future. And there's very few instruments that can support communities in making that change, very few financial instruments. In fact, the Environment Agency have some pilot programs on that currently running now, but there's no real means of engaging the communities and supporting them both in a planning way and in a financial way to potentially move landward. And that is definitely a real gap.
So is this because the planning system tends to look back and it looks for evidence from the past of what's happening to population, what's happening to the need for certain use classes in certain areas, and so you will build that because it looks like you need that. Whereas what we're talking about now is planning for the future and having to look ahead. Is that?
Well, yeah, I think that's right. I think there's some degrees of truth in that, and I'm not surprised to hear from Paul saying that London will be protected. Of course, it will be protected. I mean, the amount of investment in London just simply generates its own case, let alone it being the centre for political power. But it seems to me that the real point behind what Paul has just articulated is that decisions are having to be made about effectively abandoning certain so-called smaller towns and places. But when we say we'll let smaller towns go, we're not understanding really what that means. That means not just where people live, but we've got the healthcare facilities where they are. We've got the transport infrastructure where they are. We've got the education systems where they are. It's very, very difficult to simply say, well, that's only a small place of, say, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 people compared to the millions that might live in the greater urban areas, and just say, we're not planning for that. But the consequences of not planning mean that we might be forced into making those quite dramatic decisions, still in the context of not knowing what we're going to do about that. So if we say, well, we're going to have to let parts of, I don't know, the Fylde coast go, or parts of the Humber Basin go, and they'll just be inundated, and that's life. Well, how many thousands of houses does that mean? And where are you going to put those people? How are those people going to be compensated for, if at all?
I think that's where I'm getting confused about this. It sounds like a very stupid thing to do, to put it in layman's terms, of planning houses in areas that are going to be underwater. I mean, how have Warrington, and presumably they're not alone, as you talk about the geography there, if you look around a map like that, how have the councils got to this position where they are planning that and they're not planning for the reality of the future?
A part of the answer must be just lack of knowledge. I mean, there's no sort of deliberateness in this conversation about people saying they are doing it even though they know it's a bad thing to do. There is a lack of knowledge in the debate, and I think I think that's probably one of the problems we have. The other factor, which I think is of some significance, is the lack of a national plan which it has to give mandatory guidance as to what this looks like. So we have a system of, as I said, quite advanced system of plan making, but it's each local authority unto themselves. There's no coordination at regional or national level about what those allocations might mean and look like. And in the absence of that, and only yesterday we had the government announcing the abandonment of housing targets in response to a potential rebellion by backbench MPs, the same MPs who have derided the need for regional plan making at the committee stage of the Levelling Up Bill. So we are genuinely sleepwalking into a problem because we don't have the framework for a sensible, coordinated debate about what the new coastline will look like, what the flooded areas will be that are most likely to be affected, and how we reallocate our resources, either to prevent areas going underwater or to do, as Paul was suggesting a moment ago, to deal with issues of relocation and to deal with issues of potential compensation. And the conversation that this is about is bringing to people's attention the need that unless we have a framework, unless we do something now, then actually we might well end up in the circumstances Paul was saying that we're seeking to avoid, which is forced abandonment because we haven't actually opened our eyes early enough.
So are any of the politicians or political parties talking about this?
I haven't detected it, Paul, in terms of the overall impact of rises in sea levels. There is some conversation about the impact of coastal erosion and flooding that will cause. And I think that's largely because, in terms of concept, that's actually it's certainly more manageable than flooding caused by rises in sea levels. So I think its short-term answers are relatively achievable there. And in some cases, we know that actually is about abandoning strips of land and houses along those areas back into the sea because it's just too expensive and disproportionately expensive to defend them. So there's knowledge about that. There's some knowledge about what to do about our drainage system to cope with pluvial flooding, which is effectively, in shorthand, it is localized flooding caused by significant bursts of rainwater, and the existing capacity of our drainage system to cope with such heavy bursts of rain. So there's some understanding of that, and there are regional water-based plans that are addressing that. But I'm not detecting much conversation, if any, about the impact of this third cause of flooding, as I say, sea level rises. And in answer to your question, Paul, about has there been anything like this before, I think in terms of the pace that we're looking at, if we just go back to the overture comment that Paul Sayers said, how sea level rises have already taken 16 centimetres, have already increased, by 16 centimetres since 1900, and of that, as I said, 10 centimetres is since 1993. I think it's the scale and the pace that's challenging. And also, we have to put into the equation that we're dealing with rises in sea levels because of the broader issue of warming climate. And so we have to understand why are the sea levels rising, and effectively there's two principal causes to that. One is water expands as air temperatures increase anyway, and secondly, you've got meltwater. So that's why a lot of it is embedded in. So we can't turn it back now. Um, and if we're dealing with a warming climate, then actually we're also dealing with places that might not be as habitable tomorrow as they might be today. They just might be uncomfortably hot. And we've had a conversation about this in terms of what are we doing in terms of our infrastructure, our building regulations, and so on, to help places now continue to be livable in 25, 35, 45 years' time. And we're not even getting that right, quite frankly. So we might have the ridiculous outcome where we're having to spend billions upon billions of our money to defend London, when at the same time Londoners are saying, I don't want to live here because it's too hot.
Well, yes, and I guess there's a levelling up argument to be had, but maybe for another day about London and the southeast getting the investment. But so what's your big ask today? In turn, I'll start with you, Paul.
I think there is a recognition and a strong focus on within government that we need to adapt faster, not a political party government, but it generally across the piece of planning, the Environment Agency. Everyone is recognising we need to adapt at pace, and everyone recognises that need that sea levels are rising, and that's one of the key responses we need to respond to. And this idea of resilience, we haven't spoken much about it now, but there's a much stronger focus on resilience, which includes property scale resilience as well as community scale, national scale infrastructure resilience. The challenge is joining all of, which kind of we started with at the start, is joining all those pieces up and actually making it happen, not only in this incremental adaptation way, but addressing those more really difficult problems of those transformational changes that we need to address, and then supporting those that are affected by that, appropriately engaging them in those discussions. So I think there is a real seriousness about it, that from what I see across those involved, and there is a real will to try and adapt at pace, but it's making it happen. So the challenge is that doing it and creating those joined up plans and creating those resilient communities, and really having that longer term plan that everyone understands and that we can follow. And just doing it isn't as easy as I've just said. It's quite a lot of complicated, many conflicts, legitimate conflicts in those discussions that have to be squared. That honest discussion around those is key.
And that's absolutely right. The what Paul's arguing for there by using the phrase joining up the plans is looking for a national, I think it has to be a national framework that joins up some of these dots for us, or allows local authorities at both the level in which they currently operate as well as at a regional level to place together what the regional impacts of these changes will be and how they at a regional level will respond. And it's bizarre, it seems to me, that we have a system of plan making that argues at the moment against regional planning on the basis it's not a democratic. It's not democratic, but we do have regional bodies. We have regional bodies in healthcare. We have regional bodies in the fire. We have regional bodies in our water. So we do have a system of regional bodies, and that's largely how the Environment Agency operates as well. So it's beyond my comprehension as to why the government continues to resist the idea, both of having some form of regional framework for the planning system, but then to legitimise that regional framework by having a more informed and sensible national framework that deals with some of these big issues. We have something called the National Planning Framework. I know that, but that does not provide for us a planning, a spatial element to the conversation that is focused. That is the focus of this conversation today.
Do you think if, as an idea that we've talked about before, Jeremy, but if there was some sort of office of climate or an office for climate change that was independent and operated in the same way as the Bank of England and really elevated this, treating it like a crisis and drawing up a sort of urgent response in a way that crossed planning authority boundaries and things like that. Is that scale of response something that might help in a case like this? Paul, what do you think?
There is the old truth that risk is probably not best managed at the location it occurs. So you can, to best manage risk, it normally means you have to do something in the upstream catchment, down the upstream coast, or there's a spatial element to the way you manage risk in a good way. So risk is definitely spatial. In terms, we have the UK Climate Change Committee, and we have the Climate Act, of course, 2008, and they hold government to task on adaptation of climate and mitigation issues. But there isn't that single planning body, if you like. I'm not totally sure which way I fall on this. I work a lot internationally, and I see in some countries they have separate climate change and climate or parts of government, and they can end up a little bit divorced from the actual planning on the ground. They can end up a little bit as a lobby group rather than actually really impacting things on the ground. So I'm not quite sure which way whether climate should be business as usual, right? It should be part of that core planning action, which it isn't currently. But so I'm not sure which way I lie on if it should be a separate planning directorate that really highlights climate issues, or that climate should be much more embedded in the business of planning.
Absolutely, it's a good point. Jeremy, what's your thoughts?
I think actually we've got an almost ready-made solution to deal with the point Paul Sayers is saying. We have a plan-making system which is overseen by an independent body called Planning Inspectorate, and there is no reason why a planning inspectorate cannot include a team, one of whom is directly responsible for assessing the integrity of policies against scientific-based expectations of what will happen if, and that's a climate change point. And it doesn't matter to me if that specific person on the panel treats it as an extreme issue and asks for significant, robust testing of the policy framework, because these policies are meant to last 25 to 30 years. And so we can have somebody in place sitting alongside every single local authority to ask the fundamental questions: have they robustly assessed the impact of their land use, their spatial allocations against a range of scientific-based forecasts of what will happen to land subject to flooding by excessive rainwater, sea level rises, coastal erosion, whether they've got matters right in terms of anticipating the need for open space because of air temperatures increasing, and so on. It's a ready-made list of questions that can be prepared by the inspectorate, and each relevant policy for spatial allocation can be tested. It's there. It's not a difficult thing to do.
Absolutely. Well, in terms of timing and scale, a short-term conversation or a snippet of an ongoing conversation in 20 or 30 minutes. Thank you again to Jeremy Hinds, and thank you to Paul Sayers for joining us. Let's keep trying to bring people to the subject and bring people to the conversation, raise awareness of what's happening, try and influence plans, and try and call for the national framework, the planning inspectorate to tool up around this. But yeah, thanks again. Hope you've enjoyed that at home, and we'll see you again soon on the PlaceTech podcast. Thank you.